In the early years of the Pacific War, Japanese naval aviators ruled the skies. From Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, from Wake Island to the skies over the Philippines, their aircraft seemed untouchable. Agile, fast, and flown by highly trained veterans, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero had earned a reputation that bordered on myth. We want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Comment below and subscribe. American pilots knew it well. They had faced the Zero again and again, and too often, they had paid the price. So when rumors began circulating among Japanese squadrons in 1943 about a new American fighter entering the war, the reaction was not fear. It was laughter. Reports described a large, bulky aircraft rolling off U.S. aircraft carriers, heavier than the Zero, slower in a turn, and built like a flying tank. Compared to the elegant lines of Japanese fighters, it looked crude, inelegant, almost clumsy. Japanese pilots believed they had seen this story before. The Americans had tried to challenge the Zero with the F2A Buffalo. They had failed. Then came the Wildcat, tougher, yes, but still outmatched. This new aircraft, they assumed, would be no different. Some pilots mocked its size. Others joked that it would be easy prey once it tried to turn with a Zero. After all, Japanese doctrine emphasized agility above all else, and no aircraft, they believed, could outturn them in the sky. What they did not know was that the Americans had stopped trying to outturn the Zero. Instead, they had learned from every defeat, every burning carrier deck, every lost squadron. And this time, the aircraft they were bringing to the Pacific was not designed to impress. It was designed to survive and to kill. The fighter's name was the F6F Hellcat. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. No revolutionary shape, no radical design. But beneath its broad wings and armored skin was something entirely new, a philosophy born from hard lessons and brutal experience. The Hellcat was not meant to dance in the sky. It was meant to dominate it. In the months ahead, Japanese pilots would learn, painfully, that laughter could be fatal. Because once the Hellcat arrived in force, the balance of power over the Pacific would begin to shift, and the skies that once belonged to Japan would never be the same again. To understand why Japanese pilots laughed at the Hellcat, you first have to understand the world they lived in. In 1941 and 1942, the skies over the Pacific belonged to Japan. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was not just an aircraft. It was a symbol of dominance. Lightweight, extraordinarily maneuverable, and possessing a range that stunned Western observers, the Zero had been built for one purpose: absolute aerial supremacy. Against it, early American fighters seemed slow, underpowered, and helpless. Japanese naval pilots were among the most elite aviators on Earth. They trained 4 years, logging countless flight hours before seeing combat. Many were veterans of China, hardened by real aerial warfare long before the United States entered the conflict. When war erupted, the results were devastating. American pilots climbing into the Brewster Buffalo or the early Wildcats quickly learned a brutal truth. If they tried to dogfight a Zero, they would die. The Zero could turn inside almost anything. It climbed faster. It bled speed effortlessly. And in the early months of the war, it seemed untouchable. This dominance shaped Japanese thinking and arrogance. Every engagement reinforced the same belief: Japanese aircraft were superior, and Japanese pilots were unmatched. So when American losses mounted, Japanese airmen assumed the problem was simple. The Americans did not understand air combat the way Japan did. They relied too much on armor, too much on firepower, too much on brute force. In Japanese doctrine, agility was everything. Speed and maneuverability won battles, not protection. If you were hit, you had already failed. This mindset led many Japanese pilots to underestimate one crucial factor: survivability. American aircraft returned riddled with holes, Japanese aircraft often did not return at all. But early in the war, these lessons were ignored, because victory came easily. Carrier task forces advanced, Allied airfields fell, and the Zero continued to carve through the skies, building a reputation that intimidated enemies before a single shot was fired. By 1942, many Japanese pilots truly believed no American fighter could challenge them, no matter how new or how large it appeared, which is why, when intelligence reports mentioned an upcoming Grumman design, heavier than the Wildcat, powered by an even larger engine, the reaction was predictable. A bigger target, a slower turn, an easier kill. What they did not realize was that the era of the Zero's unquestioned dominance was already ending. Because while Japanese pilots celebrated their victories, American engineers and tacticians were quietly rewriting the rules of air combat, and the aircraft that would end the Zero's reign was already taking shape, far from the Pacific, in factories where failure was no longer an option. The F6F Hellcat, it was not born from confidence. It was born from failure. By 1942, the United States Navy had learned a painful lesson. Courage alone could not overcome inferior aircraft. Every encounter with the Zero delivered new data and new losses. But unlike their enemy, American planners did not ignore those lessons. They studied them. Wrecked aircraft were analyzed. Pilot debriefings were dissected. Every advantage the Zero possessed was catalogued in detail, and one conclusion became clear. Trying to outturn the Zero was suicide. Instead of chasing agility, American engineers focused on something else entirely: power, durability, and firepower. At Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, the company responsible for the Wildcat, a new fighter was already on the drawing board. The Navy did not ask for elegance, it asked for dominance. The result was the F6F Hellcat. Everything about the aircraft reflected hard-earned experience. It was built around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, one of the most powerful radial engines in the world. With more than 2,000 horsepower, it gave the Hellcat raw speed and explosive climbing ability. The aircraft was armored, the cockpit was protected. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. Unlike the Zero, which sacrificed protection for agility, the Hellcat was designed to bring its pilots home, even when hit. Its wings carried 6.50 caliber machine guns, capable of shredding enemy aircraft in seconds. And unlike earlier fighters, the Hellcat could absorb punishments while delivering devastating firepower. But the most important change was invisible. American tacticians were abandoning old dogfighting instincts. The Hellcat was designed to fight on its own terms, diving from above, striking with speed, and climbing away before the enemy could react. This was not a duel. It was controlled violence. Grumman engineers famously said they built the Hellcat so strong that if the engine failed, the pilot could fly the aircraft back to the carrier, using the remaining pieces. It was not a joke. Carrier landings were brutal. Combat damage was expected. Survival was mandatory. By late 1942, prototypes were already flying. Test pilots immediately recognized what this aircraft represented. It was not beautiful. It was not graceful, but it was deadly. And while Japanese pilots laughed at rumors of a large, heavy American fighter, the Hellcat was quietly becoming exactly what the Pacific War demanded. A machine designed not to impress the enemy, but to break him. The first F6F Hellcats arrived in the Pacific in early 1943, not in overwhelming numbers, not with dramatic announcements. They simply appeared on carrier decks, larger than Wildcats, broader in the wings, and unmistakably American. Japanese pilots noticed immediately. At a distance, the Hellcat looked slow, heavy, predictable. In early encounters, Japanese aviators approached these new fighters with confidence. Some even reported feeling relief, believing the Americans had once again chosen size over skill. The Hellcat did not look like a threat, and at first, that assumption seemed correct. When pilots tried to turn with the Zero, the Hellcat lost. Its wider wings and heavier frame could not match the Zero's legendary agility. Japanese pilots smiled. But then something unexpected happened. The Hellcat stopped turning. Instead, they dove. With the power of the double Wasp engine behind them, Hellcats dropped from altitude at terrifying speed. They slashed through Japanese formations, fired in short, devastating bursts, and then climbed away, untouched. Zeros tried to follow. They couldn't. The Hellcat was faster in a dive, stronger in a climb, and capable of absorbing damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Japanese pilots began to notice something deeply unsettling. Hits that should have been fatal were not enough. Hellcats returned to their carriers with holes in their wings, shattered control surfaces, and oil-streaked fuselages, and still flew again the next day. Zeros did not. What began as isolated engagements soon formed a pattern. Hellcat pilots were no longer reacting. They were dictating the fight. They chose when to engage. They chose when to break off. And Japanese pilots, accustomed to total control of the sky, found themselves chasing an enemy that refused to fight by their rules. After-action reports grew tense. Pilots warned each other not to pursue the new American fighter in a dive, not to assume it was slow, not to underestimate its firepower. The laughter began to fade. In its place came something far more dangerous, doubt. Because for the first time since the war began, Japanese pilots were encountering an aircraft that did not fear them. An aircraft that could take punishment, strike with overwhelming force, and leave the battlefield intact. The Hellcat had arrived, and the Pacific sky was no longer the Zero's domain alone. By mid-1943, the laughter was gone. What replaced it was confusion and fear. As Hellcat squadrons increased in number, something unprecedented began to emerge in combat reports. Engagement after engagement ended the same way. American pilots were returning. Japanese pilots were not. The numbers told a brutal story. In battle after battle, Hellcats were achieving kill ratios that defied belief. 5-1, 7-1, sometimes even higher. For Japanese commanders, this was unthinkable. The Zero had never faced such losses. And yet, the pattern continued. The Hellcat was not winning through chance or surprise. It was winning consistently. The reason was discipline. Hellcat pilots were trained to resist instinct. They did not chase turning fights. They did not pursue fleeing enemies into traps. They climbed, they dove, they struck, and they disengaged, again and again. Japanese pilots, trained for close-in maneuvering, found themselves fighting an enemy who refused to play their game. When they tried to turn, the Hellcat broke away. When they tried to climb, the Hellcat arrived from above. When they scored hits, the Hellcat kept flying. Even experienced Japanese aces struggled to adapt. Their aircraft, once unmatched, was now exposed. The Zero's lack of armor meant that a single burst from 6.50 caliber machine guns could tear it apart. Fuel tanks ignited, wings failed, pilots had no second chances. American pilots, meanwhile, survived mistakes. Hellcats came back with shattered canopies, wounded pilots, and engines barely running, but they came back. Every returned pilot meant experience gained. Every lost Japanese pilot meant experience gone forever. This imbalance accelerated the shift in air power. By late 1943, Japanese pilots no longer laughed when they saw a Hellcat silhouette. They warned each other. Some avoided combat entirely if possible. The Hellcat had become something the Zero never was, a machine that multiplied pilot skill instead of depending on it. And as the kill ratios climbed, one truth became undeniable. The air war over the Pacific had changed, permanently. If you're amazed so far, hit like and comment your thoughts. Statistics can explain victory, but voices explain fear. As the Hellcat tightened its grip on the Pacific sky, the most revealing evidence came not from charts or reports, but from the words of the men who faced it. American pilots spoke of confidence. For the first time in the war, they climbed into their cockpits believing they had the advantage. The Hellcat could climb fast, dive faster, and absorb punishment that would have doomed earlier fighters. Many pilots described the same feeling: relief. Relief that they no longer had to fight perfectly just to survive. One U.S. Navy aviator later recalled being hit multiple times by zero fire, watching warning lights flicker across his panel, and still making it back to the carrier. In any other plane, he said, I would have been dead. Japanese pilots told a different story. Interrogation reports and post-war testimonies reveal growing frustration. Pilots described firing on Hellcats only to watch them dive away, trailing smoke, and return minutes later with reinforcements. Some spoke of helplessness. The Zero's guns required precision and proximity. But the Hellcat did not need perfect aim. A short burst was often enough. Japanese pilots noticed something else, something deeply unsettling. Hellcats attacked in groups, coordinated and disciplined. They did not chase individual kills. They protected each other. This was not the style of air combat Japanese pilots had trained for. One former Imperial Navy pilot later admitted that facing the Hellcat felt like fighting a machine that never tired. Flown by pilots who were becoming more skilled with every battle, morale suffered. Young Japanese pilots rushed through shortened training programs, entered combat against Hellcats flown by veterans who had already survived dozens of missions. The imbalance was merciless. Where Japanese pilots felt hunted, American pilots felt in control. The sky itself seemed to favor the Hellcat, and in the minds of those who flew against it, one realization took hold. This aircraft was not just superior, it was unforgiving. The F6F Hellcat did not dominate the Pacific by accident. It won because every part of it was designed for one environment and one enemy. At the heart of the Hellcat was power. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, its speed, the Zero could not match a dive, an altitude performance the Japanese fighter struggled to follow. This allowed Hellcat pilots to control distance, the most important factor in aerial combat. Then there was protection. Unlike the Zero, the Hellcat was armored where it mattered most. The cockpit shielded its pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires that would have instantly consumed Japanese aircraft. This meant Hellcat pilots could make mistakes and live. Firepower was another decisive factor. 6.50 caliber machine guns delivered a volume of fire the Zero could not withstand. Even brief bursts were lethal. Where Japanese pilots needed accuracy and time on target, Hellcat pilots needed only seconds. But perhaps the most important advantage was doctrinal. American tactics evolved alongside the aircraft. Hellcats fought as teams. They climbed together, attacked together, and disengaged together. Pilots were taught to abandon fights they could not win, and return with reinforcements. Japanese doctrine, built around individual skill and honor, struggled to adapt. The Zero had been designed for a generation of elite pilots. The Hellcat was designed for war at scale. It turned average pilots into effective killers, and skilled pilots into aces. As one U.S. commander summarized it bluntly, the Hellcat wasn't about finesse. It was about results. By 1944, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The skies over the Pacific were being rewritten, not by daring turns or heroic duels, but by discipline, engineering, and overwhelming force, and the Hellcat embodied all of it. By 1944, the Hellcat was everywhere. From the decks of American carriers to remote island airstrips, its broad wings and blunt nose became a constant presence in the Pacific sky. And in the great carrier battles that followed, its impact became undeniable. Nowhere was this clearer than during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, as Japanese carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft. Hellcat squadrons rose to meet them. Radar guided American fighters into position, allowing Hellcats to attack with altitude, speed, and surprise. What followed would later be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese formations were torn apart before they could even reach the fleet. Hellcats dove from above, firing relentlessly, then climbed back into position for another pass. Zeros tried to fight back, but they were overwhelmed. Many Japanese pilots never even saw the aircraft that destroyed them. In a single day, Japanese naval aviation lost hundreds of aircraft. The losses were irreplaceable. Trained pilots, carefully built over years, vanished in hours. American losses were minimal. The Hellcat had transformed carrier defense into slaughter. Similar patterns emerged across the Pacific. At Leyte Gulf, Hellcats protected invasion forces and shattered desperate Japanese air attacks. Kamikaze missions would soon replace traditional air combat, a grim acknowledgement that conventional aerial dominance had been lost. For Japanese commanders, the reality was unavoidable. They could no longer contest the skies. The Hellcat did more than win dogfights. It erased Japan's ability to wage air war on equal terms. From that point forward, American fleets moved under a shield of air superiority. Japanese aircraft attacked from desperation, not confidence. The sky, once a weapon of Japanese expansion, had become a barrier they could no longer cross. And at the center of that transformation flew the F6F Hellcat, methodical, relentless, and unstoppable. By the final year of the war, the outcome in the Pacific skies was no longer debated. It was accepted. The F6F Hellcat had become the most successful naval fighter of World War II. More enemy aircraft were destroyed by Hellcats than by any other Allied fighter, a fact that stunned even those who had designed it. But its true legacy went far beyond numbers. The Hellcat proved that air superiority was no longer about individual brilliance alone. It was about systems, training, tactics, logistics, and machines built to survive repeated combat. American pilots rotated home, shared their experience, and returned to combat stronger. Aircraft were repaired, replaced, and improved at an industrial scale Japan could not match. The Zero, once feared, became obsolete in the face of this reality. New Japanese designs struggled to keep pace. Fuel shortages limited training. Pilot quality declined. The gap only widened. The Hellcat, meanwhile, continued to evolve. It adapted to ground attack, bomber escort, and fleet defense. It carried rockets and bombs. It protected fleets, supported landings, and crushed resistance from above. For Japanese pilots who survived the war, the Hellcat became a symbol, not of American arrogance, but of inevitable defeat. It represented a moment when the balance of power shifted beyond recovery. And for American naval aviation, it set the standard. Future fighters would be faster, more advanced, more complex. But none would ever so clearly embody the lesson learned in the Pacific. Air wars are not won by elegance. They are won by endurance. The story of the F6F Hellcat is, at its core, a story of transformation. Japanese pilots once laughed at its appearance, a large, unwieldy fighter that seemed nothing more than a lumbering target. They underestimated it. They misjudged it. And in doing so, they faced a harsh reality. The Pacific sky had changed forever. By the end of the war, the Hellcat was more than a machine. It had become a legend. Pilots who flew it spoke of its reliability, its raw power, and the confidence it instilled. Engineers took pride in the fact that their design had rewritten the rules of naval aviation. Commanders recognized that air superiority could be built, not just earned. Japanese accounts, once filled with derision, gradually transformed into respect, sometimes bitter, sometimes awe-filled. They called it a flying tank, a term meant as both critique and acknowledgement of its toughness. The Hellcat's victories were decisive, its influence enduring. It dominated carrier battles, protected amphibious landings, and reshaped the strategy of the Pacific War. In countless engagements, it turned the tide in favor of the Allies. More than technical specifications, more than tactics, the Hellcat became a symbol of American resilience, innovation, and adaptability. It demonstrated that victory in war is not always won by elegance, speed, or tradition. Sometimes, it is won by learning from defeat and building something stronger. And for those who look back at the Pacific War today, the story is clear. Laughter turned to fear, mockery turned to legend, and the F6F Hellcat forever changed the skies above the Pacific. Its shadow remains in every discussion of naval aviation, a reminder that in war, underestimating your enemy can be fatal, and that ingenuity, discipline, and determination can create a fighter that dominates history itself. What do you think about this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Support the channel by subscribing and sharing this story with your friends. It helps a lot.